Many viewers wrote in with an unusual request. Could we touch on the immaterial on the show, things like math? Evolution is a Myth tweeted, thoughts on doing a show about immaterial stuff like laws of logic, math? Kevin Lane also tweeted, I would very much like to see how logic and math are more than just descriptions of a physical reality. And Nunya Beeswax followed up afterwards with another tweet. Excellent work. When is your episode coming about immaterial things that couldn't possibly have evolved? Do Darwinists think that Pythagorean's theorem evolved from the number 4 and 4 from 3? As some would argue, the principle here being that you cannot describe immaterial things like mathematics, which obviously exist, therefore you cannot argue against the existence of a creator God with material science. For example, what could science possibly say about love? We all know it exists, yet scientifically speaking, love can hardly be called observable, and it certainly isn't repeatable, nor is it predictable. It is the same argument with whether or not a creator God exists. Now, I would contend, however, that the science that verifies our creator's existence is observable, repeatable, and predictable, and that is what this show is devoted to. Now, one of the ways this is seen is by using the immaterial, like mathematics, to interpret the material world scientifically. But how is this done? To bring us great joy, I am joined by mathematician Alan Montgomery. Alan has a degree in mathematics and has worked in the field of actuarial mathematics, which is used in mortality studies for insurance companies and pension plans. Hello, Alan.
Hello, Ian. What's the probability you're alive today?
I'll answer that after I drink my coffee. In Crevo Rant number 107 and on multiple episodes of Genesis Week, I discussed Miller's experiments in the origin of life. His purpose was to create amino acids that are essential for life. He had many problems with his experiment, the first of which was he designed the experiment for the purpose of making amino acids. He did not simulate a non-purposeful creation of amino acids. He reacted chemicals at a temperature of over 150 degrees Celsius. He removed oxygen in his apparatus, so had he succeeded in creating life, his apparatus would have killed it. Next, he only made 2 out of the 20 needed amino acids. So he's missing 18 amino acids. Now today, using different temperatures and conditions, 16 of the needed amino acids have been made, still 4 short.
Yes, the scientists focus on chemicals rather than the organization of chemicals. That's because that's part of their mission, and the easiest part of their mission is to focus on, actually making the chemistry. But that doesn't get them out of the sandbox. They're still playing around. The hard part is ordering the chemicals that they make into sequences that actually produce life. Life is not in the chemicals. Life is in the organization of the chemicals into information and function. This is not on the chemicals, but it's on the order of the chemicals. If I had a license plate, right, you could perhaps design an experiment that would produce the raw metal from, say, ore and lightning, but the metal doesn't tell the policeman if I own the car. It's the sequence of the numbers on the plate that tells the policeman that I own the car or somebody else does and I stole it, right? Or if you make a distress call using, a telegraph, you send ... and everybody knows the SOS code from Morse code and knows that you're in trouble. But does it really matter whether you use, a telegraph key or a telephone or a radio to communicate I'm in distress or SOS? The way you transmit the information isn't really the problem. It's the code that you use to transmit that. You cannot invent Morse code randomly. You have to know it, use it, and decode it. So your DNA is storing information in the order of the chemicals that are in the cell. This is why you call it a code. It's not that the chemicals are irrelevant. They're just like dead matter in the process. To solve the origin of chemicals does not solve the problem of the origin of life. So another illustration would be taking an egg, beating it up in a bowl, putting it in a jar and sealing it off so there's no bacteria, and waiting for it to produce life. Well, it's not going to produce life because you've destroyed the order. But you have all the chemistry there. So DNA has like 4 chemical letters: cytosine, thymine, guanine, and adenine. And when you take 3 of these together, they form basically a genetic word. And that word is associated with a particular amino acid. So when you string all these things together, you get a system where you can code a certain string of amino acids, and that makes a protein, and the proteins are the workhorses in your cell.
So where does the math come in?
Well, if a protein is intelligently sequenced, we can ask what is the probability of getting this sequence randomly? Well, this first assumes that God is not the one that is sequencing these amino acids into proteins. So you're basically starting off with an assumption of unbelief, right? So that's one problem. You're not really doing science openly. You're doing science with the presupposition that God doesn't exist. So the scientists have been trying to claim that you can order these things randomly without any intelligent input. And of course, if a scientist uses his university learning and his God-given intelligence to create life, that would not count as random, unless, of course, he was a complete idiot.
And he would have to prove he was an idiot.
Oh, yeah, and that might take intelligence as well. Yes. So they insist that if you produce enough proteins by some great protein factory over a very long period of time, sooner or later, a usable, life-giving protein will just happen. Monkeys typing on typewriters until the word appears randomly. Well, we can calculate this probability. I mean, this is something that's subject to mathematical probability theory, right? So let's try looking at a very, very simple protein called proinsulin. It's very, very short. It's only 84 amino acids long. So you've got a big chain of 84 amino acids, and that's a protein. Its position can be filled at each one of those 84 spots by one of 20 different life-giving amino acids. That means that you have 10 to the power 84 possibilities. Or if you don't like thinking in base 20, it's 10 to the power 106. That's a very big number, and we'll chop that down a bit little later when we talk about how long this is. Dr. Eden estimates that in the entire Earth history, all the life on Earth has produced about 10 to the 52 proteins. Assuming that they're all different and assuming that they're all 84 units long, we can then say that we can now divide the 10 to the 52 into 10 to the 106, and we say there's only one probability in 10 to the power 54 that one of these is proinsulin. So that's one chance in a million, trillion.
Wow. But proinsulin is very short for a protein. What might be the average size?
Oh, your average protein might be closer to 400 units long. So if we then try to create something that was like an average length long, and we took all the atoms on the face of the Earth, and the limiting factor here is nitrogen. You take all the nitrogen on the face of the Earth, and you can make 10 to the 41 sets of amino acids, which independently could make a protein 400 units long, right? So each independent set then is able to take a shot at making this particular average length protein, right? So let's make a little machine that assembles as many proteins as possible from all these 10 to the 41 sets, and let's get them working at 30 million billion per second, or 10 to the 24th proteins per year. So that's a pretty large number, but it's nowhere near the number you actually sort of need to get to. So with this 10 to the 41 sets and 10 to the 24th proteins per year, you can then generate 10 to the 65 in total with all these different independent sets. And then if you take life history and say it's 5 billion years, that extends it out to 5 times 10 to the 24 proteins. Not 24, 74 proteins. So that's a pretty big number too. It's getting close to the number of atoms in the universe, but we're really not anywhere near, the possibility of getting, a usable protein of length 400, because you're starting with 20 in each slot. You got 400 slots. That's 20 to the power 400. And if you put that back to base 10, that's 10 to the power 520. That's nowhere near 10 to the power 74. So you end up with that's just on the face of it, one chance in 10 to the power 446. You could produce the proteins, but one protein that we're looking at. And of course, such a number is like just, out of this universe. It's not even out of this world, it's out of this universe. Okay? So if we cut this down a bit, sort of allow a certain number of substitutions along the chain, some proteins you change one amino acid and the protein's useless and you die. But let's just, cut the odds down a bit, and let's say, once every 100 proteins, you can do one substitution, right? We can then bring the odds down to 1 in 10 to the power 171. So that's a pretty big number.
How do we comprehend such big numbers?
Well, imagine you've got like a little single-celled animal like an amoeba, and it's going to carry one atom on the face of this earth somehow right out to the radius of the edge of the universe and back at the rate of 1 inch every year. And after that amount of time's gone by, we're nowhere near close to getting to a protein which would be life-giving. So imagine that we do this with the entire solar system. Well, that's nowhere near it either. What if this amino acid moved every single atom in the universe and back? Well, that only brings us to 10 to the power 107. So we're still way behind the 8 ball here. The amino acid, the amoeba would have to move every atom in the universe out to the edge and back 10 to the 64 times before you would expect to get that one life-giving useful protein. That's 10,000 trillion to 1. It's just impossible. And then, of course, you can't really see the problem of, you can readily see the problem of getting all the 400 proteins you get all the proteins in a single cell in your body, which are in the thousands. Well, you have to get all of them made, so that's like multiplied again. But then you have to get them in the same place, and you have to get them there at the same time.
Same place and time in the entire universe.
It just doesn't work. So when the scientists talk about this, and they're Darwinists and they don't want to admit God, what they do is they wave their hands around and say, given enough time. Well, 15 billion years isn't even a drop on a drop on a drop. in the bucket of what you need. So by just waving their hands and saying, given enough time, they are avoiding the problem.
But yet, I already know what the skeptics will say. It's a remote chance, but it's not a zero chance.
Yeah. I talked to a university student who, we were taking a course in geology, and he sort of said the same thing to me, that, we've just seen a lecture, and evolution is a fact. And so I gave him a little 10-minute speech on the probabilities of getting life from non-life, and he came back with the same answer. Yes, the chance is not zero. You haven't proven it's actually impossible. So I asked him, what if somebody rose from the dead and told you it was impossible? And he didn't quite understand that because, but it stopped and made him think.
Which is interesting that you use that analogy, because that is exactly what we're talking about, life from non-life. It's the exact same thing as if someone rose from the dead. It's life from non-life.
And what I was actually trying to communicate to him, if someone was in heaven and came back and said, there's a heaven and God designed life, what would you say then? And, the idea of hanging on to this one thread that maybe 1/10,000th of a million, billion, trillion, trillionth of a chance is actually what he's standing on versus, somebody who actually knows, and basically didn't have an answer. He just sort of looked at me blankly. And it's because, you see, his suppositions are, one, that God doesn't exist. So anything that proves God doesn't exist, must have a flaw in it.
And actually, technically, the chance is zero.
Well, yes, but when would somebody be able to win the lottery 165 weeks in a row without the police setting up a fraud investigation after maybe 3 weeks? These people are basically saying that no matter how small the probability, I can believe there is no God. But that's what they started out with. If you you can't do science and say, I know the outcome before I do the experiment. That's not science. What you have is a belief system that won't let science tell you anything but what you've decided to believe beforehand.
And if somebody won the lottery 165 weeks in a row, nobody would say it was an accident.
No, there's no accident in winning the lottery 165 times in a row. Somebody's fixing the system, and the police are going to investigate that.
All right. Thank you for taking the time for the viewers and for myself for being on the show today.
Well, thank you for calling me, Ian.
Stick around. We'll be back in 1 minute.